Our radio audience is listening via X-Rays FM stations, 107.1 FM and 91.1 FM, and TV viewers will watch today's programming on community media television. We are incredibly grateful for the support of all the media partners that bring City Club forums to our entire community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, we have sponsors, volunteers, and staff who enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs. A special thank you goes out to Earthquake Tech, who have sponsored today's event, as well as EcoTrust for working with us to bring Friday Forum to this space. EcoTrust is a nonprofit organization based right here in this building, working for an equitable, prosperous, and climate-smart future. EcoTrust believes in the power of convening people around great ideas. By hosting an event in this building, your dollars support their work to create economic opportunity, environmental well-being, and social equity in this place and city we call home. Thank you also to Tierra del Sol for providing wonderful food, which we are all enjoying. We appreciate, yay, thank you. We appreciate everyone who has made this event possible. Our special guest today is Dr. Lucy Jones. She is known in national media outlet as the Earthquake Lady. She has been a prominent public voice for earthquake resilience, conducting thousands of interviews, appearing on all major news networks, as well as NPR, PBS, and numerous TV specials about earthquakes and disasters. Right now, Dr. Jones is in residence at the University of Oregon for this month. She's the Wayne Morris Chair for Law and Politics. Previous to that, and I think concurrent, she's been a research associate at the Seismological Library of Caltech since 1984 and has authored more than 100 scholarly papers on seismology. She completed 33 years of federal service at the U.S. Geological Survey and most recently was their science advisor for risk reduction. In that role, she led the USGS creation of a national science strategy to promote the science that would better prepare the nation for future natural hazards. She's also the founder of the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, with a mission to foster the understanding and application of scientific information in the creation of more resilient communities. Working with both the public and the private sectors, Dr. Jones seeks to increase communities' ability to adapt and be resilient to the dynamic changes of the world around them. Her aim is to understand and communicate where the greatest vulnerabilities lie and what actions can be taken to reduce those risks in a way that is the most cost-effective. Dr. Jones is the author of this book, The Big Ones, How Natural Disasters Have Shaped Us and What We Can Do About Them. It came out in 2018 and was an Amazon Best Science book of that year. She's going to speak again Tuesday, October 22nd at 4 p.m. at the University of Oregon Portland White Stag Building. Her title for that talk is The Looming Cascadia Earthquake, What You Need to Know. That event is free. Now, her title of the talk for today is Learning from the Big Ones, How Natural Disasters Affect Human Communities. Please welcome Dr. Lucy Jones.
Well, thank you all for having me, and both here and online and on the radio. It's wonderful to be up here. As a Southern Californian, I appreciate the chance to get some rain because I don't have to get it so often. I want to talk to you today about natural hazards, not just earthquakes, and really think about what they mean for human society and the way we go about dealing with them. And I hope as we go through it, I'm going to help shift how you think about natural disasters and the ways in which we get ready for them. I want to start from the principle that natural hazards are natural. Right? They result from processes that are necessary for life on Earth. You know, we put our cities near beautiful rivers because we need the water to to grow our crops, to take, to run our manufacturing, to use our cities. But any river eventually will flood, and there will always be a flood at some point greater than the flood control systems that you've put in place. You might think we should be able to avoid volcanoes. You guys obviously don't. But the reality is those volcanoes create incredibly fertile soil. And human societies have built on the slopes of volcanoes around the world. Even earthquakes give you things that make a better society, for a better environment. The San Francisco Bay is there because two faults have pulled apart and created the depression in between many of the major harbors around the world. Again, preferential human settlements are in places where faults are causing that. So they are fundamentally natural, and they are driven by heat. Right? It's obvious in the atmospheric disasters. Think about it. You have the water that gets evaporated off the ocean and comes over and brings the rain. And it's fundamentally a heat cycle to redistribute heat around the world. Actually, geologic hazards are as well. It's just a much slower time frame to cool off the interior of the Earth than it takes to move around atmospheres. It takes hundreds of millions of years for those hot rocks to come up at mid-ocean ridges, cool into plates, move down, and eventually get subducted. But the same process that's creating our earthquakes, our volcanoes, is all a way of cooling off the Earth. So the process, the hazard, is completely natural. What, of course, the disaster is not. The disaster is there because of human choices that are made about the way in which we live with those disasters. Here in Oregon, I often like at this point to try and talk about your local hazard, and you just have such an abundance to choose from that it's hard to be really specific. Obviously, the Great Cascadia earthquake has managed to get into the public consciousness. It is a very rare event. Before or in between those earthquakes, you're going to have a lot more floods, a lot more landslides especially. I'll just point out, landslides are one of the least appreciated hazards in the country. The total cost of landslides around the nation work out at about $2 to $3 billion per year, which is about half the total rate of earthquakes. So they are in the same ballpark as all of the earthquakes that we have in terms of the losses that they cause, but because they happen basically one at a time. Each landslide only damages a few houses. We respond emotionally in a different place. I mean, who's as scared of landslides as you are of earthquakes? Who thinks landslides are more dangerous than earthquakes? Right? That's just not where we go. And yet they really are in the same ballpark. And that's a thing to keep in mind as we keep on looking at this, that idea that we have a different emotional reaction when many people get affected at the same time. And actually, that is not an irrational part of this, as we'll see as we go on. Because those natural disasters are resulting from natural processes, we know where they're going to happen. You have floods near rivers, you have earthquakes near faults, you have volcanic eruptions at volcanoes. We know where the disasters are going to be. What we don't know is when. And we fundamentally don't know when. Many people think that an earthquake's going to happen when you've built up the stress on the fault. Except wherever we have data to see the long-term pattern of earthquakes, they are best expressed as a Poissonian distribution. That's also called a memoryless distribution, which means the time of the last event doesn't matter. There's a place in California where we can see the last 11 earthquakes on the San Andreas Fault with really accurate data. It's a beautiful study actually done by a graduate of the University of Oregon who we've snagged down into California. And she's been able to show that at this place, the average interval between earthquakes on the San Andreas is 100 years. But 3 of them are less than 50 years apart, and 1 pair were 300 years apart. So the time, and that actually, it's fit by a Poissonian distribution. So the time of the last earthquake doesn't really matter. We don't know when it's coming. And of course on floods, right? We do know the floods are more likely when, in California, I say in winter. Here, it's of course you've got your spring melt as well that's going to be affecting it. We know that, but we don't know which year's going to be the bad one, right? Is this going to be a year that has a lot of it? Is this going to be a really hot summer that has a lot of wildfires? That part is random, and we hate it. Human beings hate things being random, right? And you can understand why when you think about how we became who we are. We evolved out in the African savanna, competing against animals with bigger muscles and stronger muscles and bigger teeth, right? Our advantage was a brain, that we could make a pattern and figure out how to be safe in that situation, right? That's how we were able to do the hunt, get our food. So our intelligence is evolved, especially in response to danger. So we are deeply instinctually driven to face danger by coming up with a pattern, right? And a pattern that allows us to be safe. And it has been a really important part of human evolution. When we could form a pattern connecting the mushrooms we just ate with the gastrointestinal distress we were suffering, we were more likely to live through and have children, right? So it is an important part of the human condition. The problem is, of course, is we make patterns even when they don't exist. We create constellations in stars. Faced with any sort of distribution, we try to make the pattern. And when human beings have gone to do this with natural disasters, the end result is we make up patterns that don't usually actually exist in reality, because we needed to find a pattern to be safe. How many of you ever heard people talk about earthquake weather? Right? Every culture in the world with significant earthquakes has a tradition of earthquake weather, but it's whatever weather they happen to have at their biggest earthquake, right? And people want to make a pattern and believe that it's significant, because otherwise, when you don't have a pattern, you are anxious all the time. All times are dangerous, and we really don't want to be there. If you look over the history of human society and the ways in which we've dealt with this, every culture has an explanation for disasters that removes the randomness, or at least they think they remove the randomness. Go back to pagan society, and you were in a disaster because the powerful gods were having some sort of fight, and you unfortunately got in the way. Volcanoes were supposed to erupt because Venus was cheating on Vulcan and he was having a male hissy fit over the problem, right? And that problem, think about being in early Roman society, being injured, suffering because you got in the way of some really powerful entities. That's probably not a bad explanation. That fits what you know about your life. At the same time, in the Jewish tradition, they rejected this because they said, look, God's good. God's somebody you can make a covenant with. He is not just going to hit you capriciously. So if you got hit by disasters, it must be your fault. And of course, in the Jewish tradition, and then became very much in the Christian tradition, the disasters were a sign of God's anger. Go back to Psalm 18, the mountains shook because of the wrath of God, right? And we kept that idea all the way through human society. I could spend a lot of time talking about this because I found it really fascinating as I read through it. I just recommend St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas if you want to look at how Western philosophy has tried to balance this idea that it must be God doing it. What about the innocent people? How do you have, were there innocents in a disastrous area, etc.? Long time, lots and lots of philosophical discussions on the problem. We stayed with that belief about disasters up until the 18th century. In 1755, there was a very large earthquake that struck Portugal. It was actually probably a magnitude 8.7. It was offshore. It created a big tsunami that came up the river that the city of Lisbon sits on. Estimates are about 60,000 dead out of the country's population at the time was about 2 million people. And it happened on the morning of All Saints' Day. So this is, of course, the country was devoutly Catholic and actually caught up at the time in the Inquisition. There were regular autos de fe being held to prosecute Protestants at the time. And of course, All Saints' Day was a holy day of obligation. Every Catholic had to go to Mass that day. The earthquake happened at 9:40 in the morning, at the height of the most popular Mass. Every church building was full. Every altar was covered in candles that all were toppled over. All of the churches collapsed. People were devastated, wiped out most of the people who had gone to church or were at church at that moment. However, the whorehouses were up on the hill, wooden buildings out of the river sediments, and they were basically spared. So it caused some theological discussion, a lot of problems, and there are sermons written at the time. Clearly, we haven't been pursuing protecting the true faith. Let's go. 30 people were executed as heretics in the next month. In Northern Europe, by contrast, where it was Calvinist, it was like there's actually a treatise from John Wesley. What more proof do we need about the sins of the Papist idolaters? In fact, the country of the Netherlands were asked for aid for Lisbon, and they were very strongly Calvinist at that point. And their response was, God has decreed what Lisbon will suffer, and it is not our place to change what God has decreed, and refused to send any aid. It led to philosophical discussions, but that was primarily confined to the intelligentsia. Voltaire wrote quite a bit against this. Both there's a poem on the Lisbon disaster, and the book of Candide is a lot about the Lisbon earthquake and rejecting the idea that this could have been God's retribution. And it's sort of interesting to recognize that he was, that idea of divine retribution was so strong that because he rejected it, he was called an atheist. He wasn't actually an atheist, but because he had rejected this idea of divine retribution, it was so central to the Western views of how God operated that they weren't really able to get there. And I don't mean, I need to make it clear, this is not a condemnation of Christianity. Every culture in the world does the same thing. In the Confucian tradition, disasters were caused because of a celestial imbalance. They said that the emperor sat at the interface between the celestial and the natural worlds, and if there was a yin-yang imbalance within the emperor's court, that was going to cause disasters. And in fact, there's a book written in 200 BC detailing what the emperor does to cause disasters. So if the emperor is too autocratic, too exerting his yang influence, that's an overabundance of yang, and we're going to see hurricanes because the yang air overpowers the yin earth. If the emperor's too weak, if he's about to die, or if he allows women in government, we are going to have an earthquake because we have too much yin going on at that point. There was an earthquake in Japan in 1923 where it was a time when the emperor was extremely ill and he hadn't been seen in public in 4 years. His son Hirohito had been named Prince Regent. The prime minister, who of course, especially in Japanese culture, the prime minister / shogun had a more prominent role and could be, a previous shogun had been overthrown because of an earthquake, and it was considered his fault. At the 1923 earthquake, the prime minister had died from natural causes a week before the earthquake. So when this earthquake happened and it devastated Tokyo, it actually destroyed 60% of the houses in Tokyo, 80% in Yokohama. It lay underneath the city and set off fires that were really, truly horrific. There got rumors going afterwards that it was actually their Korean neighbors who were setting the fires and poisoning the wells. It was, there's debate of how much involvement the government had because, of course, by diverting attention to the Koreans, it took it away from the government. It came with a really horrific outcome, though. 6,000 Koreans were slaughtered by their neighbors in the next 4 days. It was essentially a ritualistic sacrifice to expiate what was going wrong in society. So it's, to me, that as I learned more about it, you can see it as being this horrific example of a horrible thing that happens. You can also see how people in fear needed to find some reason for what was going on. And American society has also turned to blaming victims when these things happen. And I think that idea that our first response to natural disasters is to find someone to blame is a deeply human condition. You know, think about Hurricane Katrina. We blamed FEMA. The reality is it requires failure at all levels of government to accomplish that amount of dysfunction. FEMA couldn't do it alone. They clearly had a role. We also blamed the victims. Why didn't they evacuate? Why were they stupid enough to stay and be there when the hurricane hit, ignoring the fact that the evacuation plans for the city required everyone to self-evacuate, and there were 100,000 people in New Orleans who didn't own a car, and there was no provision made for how they were to be getting out. But when we look at it and we saw how horrible it was, we didn't want to believe that that could happen in an American city. So we created this narrative of how it was the victim's fault and how they were out there rioting and how they were out there stealing, none of which really carried through and turned out to be true. So that need to blame is very fundamental, and if we are aware of it, we can try and stop it the next time. It's going to be a natural response. What do you think of when you hear somebody's got cancer? Isn't the first thing you think, well, were they a smoker? We want to find a way to blame the victim for the problem because it's a way of saying it won't happen to me. And I think that's driving a lot of what we do in the earthquake, or in all of the disaster realms. And I would suggest that rather than looking to blame after, we try to look at what we can prevent before. Because those natural disasters, the natural hazards are inevitable, but the natural disasters are not. And we can make choices. One of the most important choices we can make is about building codes. I'll admit that when I walked in here for lunch and I saw all this brick, it made me a bit nervous. I was really glad to be able to find these metal reinforcement bars along the side, which allows me to stay here for lunch. I'm serious. I don't eat lunch in an unreinforced building. I would never consider having an office in an unreinforced building. I wouldn't buy a brick building even reinforced, because I know that the reinforcement is about not killing me, not about keeping the building usable. Right? So we have choices, we just have to be aware that we are doing them. When you have really good building codes, it can really make a difference. The magnitude 9 in Japan in 2011 killed about 150 people. They essentially had no buildings come down in the earthquake. Of course, it also triggered a tsunami that was larger than we have ever seen before. You know, the scientists do their best to get the information of what's likely to be. And the most slip we'd ever seen on a fault was 35 meters. That's about 100 feet. That means that, you know, in the time of a few seconds, that fault's going to move, one side's going to move 100 feet with respect to the other. In the Japanese earthquake, it moved 72 meters, or about 260 feet. So it was more than twice as large as we had ever seen in the past. And because of that, it created a much larger tsunami than's ever been seen, and of course overwhelmed many of the defenses. And when we go and look at what's happening there in Japan, I've actually been inspired. I was invited to go over, actually it began through going to talk at the University of Tohoku about how science can be used to work with policymakers. I met someone else who had been studying the politics of disasters, how the governance of disasters. And she introduced me to a group that was supporting victims, women in Tohoku area, a feminist group. And I'm sort of going, feminist, Northeast Japan, isn't that a pretty traditional part of the country? And it was like, yeah, and that's the issue. Here was a society that had very limited opportunities for women, but really for everyone, where the traditional structures were all very much in place. And when you got into these small towns along the coast that were really devastated by the tsunami, their societies were torn apart. There were cities that lost 15% of their population. And there was one town that we went to that not only lost that, they lost their whole city government because they heard the prediction of a 5-meter tsunami, and they knew they had a 6-meter seawall. So the city council stayed in their city hall to deal with the earth, to decide on how to respond to the earthquake, having the meeting of the city council. A 14-meter tsunami came through, washed through the building. There was only a trap door to get to the roof, and only about 5 people were able to get to the roof and escape. Everyone else died. And they lost their whole city council. How do you recover in a community like that? Right? And that's, I'm sort of wandering around a little bit on my topics. That's where I wanted to get to think about recovery. That emotional part of the earthquake makes us worry about the moment at which it's going to happen. And how many people want predictions from us? What are you going to do with the prediction? Do you want 2 hours to get out of a building, or a building that doesn't fall down in the first place? You don't have a home to come back to. You don't have a society to rebuild just with prediction. But emotionally, it's what we think we need. And that's where I want to bring us to, is to say, let's think about what recovery means, and how are we going to get through these disasters, and what is our society going to be like afterwards? You know, when we look at what's happened in previous disasters, there are cities that never recover. You know, in New Orleans, it's recovering, but the city is barely half the size it was before the event. People left and didn't come back. Right? San Francisco, it was the only city on the West Coast that mattered in 1905. After the 1906 earthquake, we saw the greatest growth decade in the history of Los Angeles. People gave up on San Francisco and came south. And before that earthquake, San Francisco was 5 times the size of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is now 5 times the size of San Francisco. And you can argue it never regained any sort of, it's really financial standing until the advent of Silicon Valley. So a really devastating disaster can really mean the end of our communities. And it's our communities that we need to turn to get ready for this. You know, way too much of disaster preparedness messaging in this country comes in as messages to individuals. You need to protect your family. You need to have supplies. You need to keep your family safe. And often you hear after that, well, what if I have protected my family but my neighbor didn't? I better put a gun in that earthquake kit. Right? That is a very, very common attitude. And when you think about it, that messaging is really isolating. You're going to be on your own. It's up to you. It's very American. We are individualists. We are all descended from people who chose to leave their family, their clan, their country, and come here to make their own life better. So we have preferentially selected our society from people who are individualists. But it doesn't work when you're facing a disaster. You're going to live through it. You know, even in the eruption of Pompeii, 90% of the people got out alive. Right? What you're going to live, the question is whether your community does. And the best way to keep a community together is to have come and made the connections beforehand. The research is really clear that the ability to recover from a disaster depends strongly on the social capital of that place. Do you connect to other people? Do you fit together? You know, I'll try to wrap this up by going back to Japan and those women I met up in Tohoku. Most of them had been very much traditional wives, children, mothers, And but once that earthquake happened and their societies were really torn apart, they had to help their families. They had to keep things going. And these women started getting out there and taking jobs and forming nonprofits and doing various activities to keep their family. And what they were discovering was new opportunities that I found really inspiring. There was particularly one woman I met. Her name was Maki Sahara. And she'd been a stay-at-home mom, getting ready for, working in her PTA when the earthquake hit. She lived in the city of Fukushima, which got hit badly, was right next to the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. They didn't even know that there was a radiation problem until people started showing up several days after the earthquakes that had been evacuated out from right next to the power plant. And these people came in to refugee centers in Fukushima City and, with only the clothes on their backs. And they had to be measured for radiation, and some of them had the clothes on their backs taken away from them because they were too contaminated. And these people are now, 5 years later, I was visiting in Fukushima, and all the refugee homes were still there. People were still living there, trying to get things to work. And this woman, Maki, she didn't know there was a problem till the people were showing up. They became really upset at the information they were not getting from the government. She went and volunteered with some anti-nuclear activists, and they created the Fukushima 30-year project to try and maintain the community. And among that, they got full-body scanners and various other radiation monitors so people could understand what was happening to them. They got monitored. They had a place where people could come and measure their food to find out if it had radiation contamination. They were able, as the radiation grew and cesium was being deposited, they ended up pushing and being able to get all the topsoil in the city removed. They took off the top 2 inches of everywhere, playgrounds, backyards, schoolyards, because enough cesium had been deposited. They had to teach their kids to play on the concrete, not on the grass, because it would be less likely to be holding the contamination. Maki was able to get Geiger counters brought to the city and training programs for the children to use them. So empower the children to know where to be able to go out and play safely. And she really has been getting her community held together. And I was really proud to see this summer she just got elected to the Fukushima City Council to be able to continue to bring this through and fight for her own community. And I want to end this with what she told me she wanted to tell the world, and I always have trouble saying it without choking up, because I asked her what she wanted to know, what she wanted the rest of the world to know. And she said, I want to be able in 20 years to look back and know we did too much to protect the children, because it would be unbearable to look back and think we'd done too little. And that's what we all have to do with dealing with disasters. What do you want to be able to look back at after the earthquake, and what's happening to your community? And is it still here, and did you do enough? Thank you. Okay. And should I take this down?
I actually don't have instructions about that, but
Okay, I'll take it. Oh yeah, you need it.
We're making a transition now to the Q&A portion, but for our radio audience, this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, coming to you from the Eco Trust building in Northwest Portland. I'm Ann Castleton, and today with us is world-renowned seismologist Dr. Lucy Jones, who's just addressed us, discussing how natural disasters affect human communities. So first, we're going to welcome one of our civic scholars from Roosevelt High School to ask the first question. After that, the floor is open to further questions, so anybody watching or listening is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question from the papers that are on your tables, you can hold it up, and a City Club person will come and get it and bring it to us. You can also submit a question via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. To those who do want to ask a question, come to the mic. Do we have a mic out in the, right there? Good, they're already there, okay. come to the mic, identify yourself, and ask one question in 30 seconds or less. Okay. Do we have the Roosevelt High School question? Okay. Do you guys want to go over and take the mic?
Hello, I'm Ty.
Try again. No?
Hello. Yep.
Well, let's take. This one's not on either. It is.
Check. Hello. My name is Ty Rooper. I'm from Roosevelt High School. I'm a senior, and my question for you guys is, how do you think we should convince people to pass earthquake policies, like people who are not like educated or who can't visit like city club meetings and stuff like that?
Okay. How do you get people to support seismic legislation? I've spent a lot of time trying to do that in Southern California, and there's a couple of things that I would say. One of them is that we have to do it together. You know, I talked a lot about community. I think it's also how that works. That if I came in and said, here's your problem, here's what I think you should do about it, I'm sort of going straight in on somebody's defenses, and there's nothing that strengthens defenses like hitting them head on. And instead what we did is we said, here's a problem, what do you think we should do about it? And spent the time to have the discussions and really involve people. The other part is to focus on the part of the problem we understand, not the part that we don't understand. So when people ask us, well, what's the chance I'm going to get hit by an earthquake? Then we're dealing with that unknown, that randomness of when the earthquake comes along. I can give you a rate, but I can't tell you when the earthquake's going to be. It might be while we're sitting here. It might not be for several hundred more years. And that uncertainty makes it really difficult to act. Instead, we need to turn it around and say, what outcome is unacceptable? What do we want our city to be after this earthquake whenever it happens? And what do we need to do to get that? And if it's acceptable to lose 1% of your buildings, if they don't kill people, it probably is for something that's far out. But if we're talking about we're going to lose the city, we're going to lose so many buildings, nobody will stay here, maybe that's an unacceptable outcome. And how do you find the difference there? So, but then I'm a scientist, so I think talking with people and exchanging information is actually helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, Hello, everyone. My name is Roberto Charbonneau, a senior at Roosevelt High School, and my question is, by giving students a seat here at the table, what is the biggest thing you're hoping or expecting us to take away by being here?
Well, I'm actually going to get to what I just said. I'm a scientist. I think information helps. I think understanding the problem is going to make a difference. I will say one thing I didn't get to as I talked so much about disasters. I think one has to think very carefully about relative risks and what's the most important thing. I tend to talk about earthquakes because that's my research. I think what's coming with climate change could be worse. It's likely to be worse, and likely to come more quickly. So I'd like you to take away that you can use science, you can use information to make better decisions. And we need to really listen to what science is telling us about what's coming, because we can't use the past, predict the future when we're making these sort of big changes.
Okay, Tom, go ahead.
Tom Dyke, City Club member. Dr. Jones, I heard you mention two magic words, building codes. And so I'd like to ask you if you've had a chance to look at building codes for the state of Oregon, which is where the power to regulate buildings exists. Would you comment on those building codes, or at least what they should look like? And could you also comment on what it costs to build highly resilient, earthquake resilient buildings which will survive an earthquake and could be put into use right afterwards? Thank you.
Okay, so on building codes, what we're building with new buildings, Oregon has the same code as California. The whole country now follows what's called the International Code Commission's building code. And for each location, you calculate what's the earthquake that has a 10% chance of happening in 50 years, because we arbitrarily said the lifespan of a building is 50 years. So 10% chance of happening, it should not collapse at all. For the earthquake that has a 2% chance of happening in that 50 years, it should not suffer total collapse. That's actually what the building code is asking for everywhere, Oregon, California, everywhere. We call it a life safety code. Make sure you can crawl out alive. And what we have seen, there's only one city that's really received its design earthquake, and that's the city of Christchurch, New Zealand. It, in 2012, had its design earthquake, and no modern building collapsed, so the building official said, hey, we did our job. 1,800 buildings had to be torn down. They are rebuilding the city because they have 95% insurance coverage, which we don't. And they are really reconsidering because they've almost lost their city. If they get another earthquake like this, they're going to lose their reinsurance. They are not going to be able to get reinsurance in the international insurance market. I think if it were up to me, we would have a functional recovery standard. The building survives intact enough to be able to recover its function. Our estimate is to build to that stronger standard will add about 1% to the cost of construction. So to save 1%, we are building buildings that are intentionally designed to be a total financial loss in the earthquake. I think it's crazy. We actually got a bill through California's legislature to start the process of developing a functional recovery standard and had it vetoed by our governor. We need to, there's a beginning of a discussion. There's a lot of us that are screaming about this. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is discussing how to develop a functional recovery code. My guess is it's going to take a decade because it's a government agency. And then we have to start building it. I'm going to add one other thing. None of that applies to an existing building. No building code in the world is retroactive. Your building is as good as the building code in place when it was built and the degree to which it was enforced. I believe seismic codes did not enter into Oregon until the 1990s.
Lucy, can you explain a little bit more about the Christchurch situation? Because you said 95% were insured and they are building back, but that they might lose their reinsurance if something happens again because they're not building to a higher standard, they're building to life safety?
To some other city. And they are still building to life safety standards. They have not upped their building code in Christchurch. Some individuals are choosing to build stronger, but it's not required in the code. And when we were discussing this in Los Angeles, one building owner, in fact, the head of the Building Owners and Management Association said, look, I don't want a building that's a total financial loss after the earthquake, but I can't afford to take the hit against my competitors now. So just up the damn code, was actually a quote from, anyway. But no, the issue in New Zealand is that all of their major cities are at risk from earthquakes. So now we have one up by Wellington, and they take that same sort of hit. The reinsurance companies have told them that if they get that sort of losses again, they're not getting reinsurance.
But did we understand correctly that all of their modern buildings built to standards survived and didn't kill people? Their unreinforced masonry buildings, what happened to those?
Well, all right, so their unreinforced masonry buildings badly collapsed, and actually that's an issue here, right? You want to keep this building because it's beautiful and it's the feeling of downtown. That's what they had in Christchurch. People did die in URMs, unreinforced masonry buildings. But also, 70% of their central business district was damaged. So 100% of it was closed. They had to close their whole central business district for 5 years because until they got rid of all of those damaged buildings, it was unsafe to be in there. So it was a huge economic hit, even to people with better buildings, because there were just too many damaged buildings around. And so that's the other aspect of this. You know, if you don't kill people because of the retrofitting, but this is now a total loss and all the surrounding buildings are badly damaged and you end up having to close off the streets, because what if an aftershock comes through and the bricks are now falling into the street? That's how a lot of people died in New Zealand, were people on the street as the brick walls fell out. There was a bus that the brick wall fell on and only one person lived in that bus.
But she lived because the bus was parked forward into a part of the building that had been retrofitted. And the rest of everybody else in the bus
front
were
part
in
of the bus, right.
non-retrofit.
Yeah,
I've
okay.
heard the... Okay, let's take the next question.
Yeah, Jeff McCarthy, City Club member. When you said that you wouldn't eat lunch in an unreinforced brick building, I said, gosh, she's not thinking like a scientist, not thinking probabilistically. When you said you wouldn't live in one, I probably agree with you. So my question is, being an expert, how would you advise city government, state government, county government, metro, on a probabilistic basis as to what to invest tax dollars in? I can give you one short concrete example. One of the reasons there is not a streetcar to Lake Oswego, aside from a cultural divide, is the requirement, I think, to reinforce a rock tunnel that's been carrying passengers for 150 years, 100 years, and the exposure for a commuter would be less than a minute a day. So I think there's a failure to consider the exposure for individual people in making these investment decisions. So my question to you is, how would you advise government to make those kind of decisions?
Well, I'll also say I am bringing this from a Southern California perspective, so the chance of an unreinforced building coming down on me is higher than it is here. Actually, the way I make that decision is not the engineering community and basically all the government decisions are probabilistic at this point. And you basically say, what's the chance of this happening? As long as the chance is low enough, it's okay. And you have to pick what you're doing on that. The chance, what's value do you place on human life? What value do you place on the recovery and all of those sort of things? I actually think that has led us into some unfortunate traps. And I like to turn the equation and say, what's unacceptable? Now, one problem is we need to accept that people die. And we have a very hard time doing that, right? Though it depends on how we kill them, right? The freeways are far more dangerous than any earthquake, right? About 1% of Americans die in a traffic accident. Something like 1 in 40, 50,000 Americans are going to die in an earthquake. So maybe it's not on that basis. And actually in California, of course, where we have had more of a focus on life safety but not on financial, we have tried to say, what is the unacceptable impact to our economy? What is going to make this society collapse? And one of the questions would be, overall, if the earthquake happened today, will Portland continue to exist as a city? Will the level of damage be enough to make it so difficult to live here people walk away? When we tried to do that in Southern California, we actually came up saying, maybe we shouldn't be putting quite so much emphasis on our hospitals, which have extremely high standards right now. And maybe we really need to be thinking about our water system, because we're not using any of those hospitals if we don't have clean water. And our water system is so vulnerable, it's almost certain to be out of function, and that's going to drive people away. And I believe your water system's probably in the same condition. And how many of you are going to stay when you haven't had a shower in a month? Because it's going to take a year to get the water systems functioning again. And we've gone through that analysis. And I guess we have finally, when we debated it by, should we fix these buildings? Well, should we do this? Should we do that? There's always a great reason to say no, right? And we didn't get anywhere. When we got we got somewhere was to say, okay, here's the big picture. Here's where the problems are. Which of these are so bad we've got to deal with them? And we came up with losing most of our affordable housing, which is the problem with a certain type of apartment building, and losing our water system. And those are the two big things that have been starting to get action on in Southern California. And Los Angeles voted on and actually passed unanimously mandatory retrofit of soft first-story buildings, a major upgrade of the water system, as well as some other measures. And we're seeing, so far, a dozen other cities have picked up the soft first-story problem, and there's another 4 communities that are really trying to grapple with the water problem, and we're starting to get some state dialogue going on that. So I think we got action by turning the question around. What's unacceptable?
I just want to say that the Portland Water Bureau has done a complete assessment of, and they have kind of a 50-year resilient plan. So if Cascadia will hold off, we're good.
You've got a lot better chance of that than we do. So that's congratulations.
Well, they've done an assessment, which is different than doing all the retrofits.
Yeah, Bill Burgle, citizen and geologist. And I want to stick to the same theme, basically, but we have 1,800 URMs. And after a couple false starts, at the current time, we are doing nothing. How would you advise us as a community of going forward and getting public money to help folks with their URMs, that sort of thing?
I guess, yeah. Okay, URM, remind you, means unreinforced masonry buildings. Those are buildings where a brick wall or a stone wall is holding up the roof. My preferred acronym is FPRs, for future piles of rubble. They are future piles of rubble. Those are the type of buildings that we really know come down in earthquakes. So how do you deal with them? I think when you look over the range of things that have worked in California, a little bit of a different situation because we do have earthquakes more often, and that helps get that incentive. Yeah, that fear of the immediate moment, that's the one we keep focused on. Los Angeles had 10,000 URMs and passed a mandatory retrofit. You had 10 years to tear it down or retrofit it, and there was no financial support. They did get it through, but it was in the immediate aftermath of an earthquake where a lot of people died in URMs. I don't think that works in a lot of other situations. What worked with the more recent retrofitting programs that we're taking were lots and lots of conversations where we brought the building owners in, we brought the apartment owners in, and sat down and said, here's the problem, help us find a solution. And I think that idea, when you do it, we need to make you do that X, you strengthen the defenses against it. It's one of the things I think that's going on with climate change. I want to just go and scream at people who don't believe it, and how stupid can you be? We've just got to do this. Well, that doesn't work. Too bad, but it doesn't. And I think what we've got to do is figure out how to have conversations. So if the city held a whole series of meetings and went to every community, every neighborhood, and said, here are your problem buildings. An earthquake, people will die in these buildings when an earthquake happens. What do you think we should do? How should we go forward? Some of the communities in California exempted churches. And then they put in mandatory for everybody else, but they said, well, the churches, they tend to be old, they tend to be bad, but they're not occupied very often. And if it's only 10 hours a week that somebody's in that building, that's a 1 in 16 chance of actually being occupied. That's a worthwhile risk given the earthquakes aren't that common. And that got it through in a lot of communities because it was the churches that were really upset and couldn't afford it, and people didn't want to lose their historic building. But that was also a conversation that happened within those communities to see where the problems are. There's one difference that makes it more difficult here. Well, at least in California, we don't have URMs in schools, right? We passed a law in 1933 that required all schools to be built to special standards, and then we passed another law in the late 50s requiring all older schools to be completely retrofitted. And we actually had another one 15 years ago that got a further upgrade. So our public schools are some of our safest buildings. In a way, it makes it harder to get the movement through because kids are already safe, so there's that motionlessness taken away. On the other hand, our kids are safe.
What about the public dollars versus people fixing their own buildings?
You know, it's interesting. In California, they've mostly not put public money into it, and yet I think there's a huge, obvious rationale for using public money because it's all of our economy that's going to be damaged after the earthquake because of those failed buildings. And there is an attempt going on to provide a tax credit that if you retrofit your building, you can get some percentage of it back as a tax credit. And I think that makes a huge amount of sense because there's a shared benefit to everybody. So far, it hasn't passed, but I would be very supportive of such a law.
Okay, we probably have time for just one more question. If it's easy, maybe two.
I hope so. I'm Debbie Kay, City Club member. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for being with us, and especially for discussing the human element as a scientist. My question is about, you've dealt a lot with public policy. My question is more about the neighborhood level. My neighborhood, our neighborhood, will have a big public event on Sunday about earthquake preparedness. Where do you see the effectiveness of those kinds? Where there will be a speaker, there will be tables where people can order the supplies. Friendly House, by the way, 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon.
They're important, and the more that it is a place where you connect with other people, even better. I'm actually starting a new program in California, in Southern California. We start our pilot next month when I get home, trying to work with community organizations. Because rather than getting individuals to take action, I want to get community groups to take action. Because your church does it, now the church members learn from the church to do it. Your church connects with the school next door and the other church and the synagogue over here. You've talked about how you can do it, how you can help each other. You're strengthening the social capital of that community. And that, to me, I think is the most important thing. Yes, people need to have individual preparedness, but what really matters is how we connect to other people and are going to be there to help each other afterwards. One more?
Let's take one more.
Thank you, Dr. Lucy. My name is Claire Briglio. I'm the Disaster Recovery Specialist and the Communications Director for the Economic Development Collaborative in Southern California. Oh. We've just went through multiple federally declared disasters, and I have a question on the recovery process and working specifically with the entrepreneurial community. I saw them as incredibly vulnerable during that period of time, especially in Montecito and losing the number of people that we did. I guess my question maybe is answered best with the answer you just gave her. How do we engage that community? Because they're so overwhelmed with information, they're required to get back up on their feet and open their business right away. And I just see this gap in.
I absolutely agree with you that that's one of the gaps, and this idea that the approach to preparedness is throw information to people and somehow pressure them into taking action on it. I don't think it works, and I don't think it's what we really need. I think it's this, instead of giving them all the information they need, if we got one piece of information that we were able to hand deliver and get them to connect to, they're going to be that much stronger. And yes, I think doing it as groups and focusing on the health of our communities as opposed to the strength of an individual, to me is what really matters.
Okay.
Can I say something really quick towards that? It's simple, really, is talking to a guy or anybody with a four-wheel drive about the value of plywood the minute we have a disaster in business. There you go. I would bring that back to California and talk to them about that.
All right. Perhaps you guys can connect afterwards. Our time is up. I just want to ask everybody a quick question. Who participated in the Great Shakeout yesterday? Last year I was under a table with Georgia Devendorf. I think this was Lucy's idea. She brought that to us. Thank you. Even though our time is up, we can continue this conversation online. You can follow City Club at PDX City Club on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Thanks to everyone who participated, and thanks especially to Dr. Lucy Jones. The meeting is adjourned.